Hello everybody. The game I am about to show you is one that featured in my Substack's mentioned last complete Pioneer Championship of Yugoslavia played in 1990. That championship was played immediately after the World Under 14 that I played in the United States, and that tournament was in the United States was particularly important to me, not so much because of the result, but because during that tournament I made one of the most important purchases in my life. I bought John Nunn's Najdorf for the tournament player. And even though previously I also studied and played the Najdorf, mostly basing my work on Lepeshkin's book in Russian, it was actually Nunn's book that propelled me and gave me the confidence to play the Najdorf on a higher level. So after having studied thoroughly the book at the Pioneer Championship, I was really confident in my black openings, and this game actually featured the Najdorf. So after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, my opponent chose the most aggressive setup with bishop g5, e6, f4, and bishop e7. I also played the poison pawn variation with queen b6 very successfully in my career. But for this game, I decided to stick to the, let's say, traditional main line bishop e7. And at that time, I remember I was quite interested to try Fischer's old favorite g takes f6, as we will soon see. So queen f3, queen c7, long castle, knight bd7, g4, b5, bishop takes f6. And nowadays, everybody basically takes knight f6. Occasionally they take bishop f6, but nobody takes g takes f6 anymore. The reason for this is that, okay, from today's perspective, this variation can be considered refuted and unplayable for black, but back in 1990 it was still considered playable and a viable alternative to the other recaptures. So in this game I decided to try it out. I was inspired by it after studying Fischer's games, especially the one he analyzed in My 60 Memorable Games, when he was describing how Soviet Grandmasters were pulling faces when he actually took g takes f6 in this position. So white plays f5. This is the best move, attacking immediately the e6 pawn. The drawback of the move is that after knight e5, the knight on e5 becomes an untouchable knight on an ideal centralized square. So queen h3, short castle. This was Fischer's concept. Castling, it appears as if into the storm, but in fact the king is quite safe after king h8 and rook g8, the typical maneuver that black plays in this line. And it appears that here my opponent kind of mixed things up because f5 and queen h3 are considered the best moves even today. But even back then, as the most promising plan was considered the plan knight c2 followed by knight f4. This was also played by Grigoric in his game against Fischer. And the knights both on f4 and d4 target the e6 pawn. And this is considered the best plan today, and thanks to this plan and the variations that follow, actually the line is unfortunately unplayable for black. But my opponent played the move bishop d3. It looks like a decent move, but in fact after this black obtains an acceptable position. So king h8, going after the typical maneuver for black in this line, king h8, rook g8. And the rook is active on the g file, targeting the g4 pawn, and also it can go to g7 and defend the h7 pawn if necessary. Rook h g1, rook g8, knight c2. Now white starts with knight c2 and intends knight f4 to put pressure on the e6 pawn. And now the first nice move by me in this game, queen b6. I like this move because it's a prophylactic move, stops white's knight f4 because the knight on d4 is hanging. rook g3 by white, introducing various ideas. One is queen h6, rook h3, even though this is parried by rook g7, but also sometimes the rooks can be doubled on the g file, g5 can happen, and so forth. And in this position, I think a very curious moment arises. The move I played, I'm still kind of proud of it, even though objectively is a bad move. But first, the reason I'm proud of it is that it shows really deep understanding of the Najdorf and this structure in particular. So, well, for a 14-year-old to play like this, it shows some understanding, I think, in a deeper level, I would also add. The drawback is that unfortunately the move loses, but the refutation is very difficult one, and therefore I can't really blame myself for not seeing it, and my opponent for missing it. So before continuing, the best move here would have been bishop d7, continuing development, okay, developing the last piece, connecting the rooks. Now the rook can come to c8, maybe, okay. There are some ideas of rook g7, rook a g8, doubling on the g file with unclear play and chances for both sides. What I played in this position was actually knight takes d3, rook d3, and e5. And this strategical transformation is what I'm really proud of, because it just shows the lack of dogma at exchanging the beautiful knight on e5 for the really silly looking bishop on d3, and then playing e5 and weakening the d5 square. But what the understanding that it shows is that black is actually able to prevent white from coming with the knight to d5. In fact, white will come with the knight on d5 later in the game, but it will be already in a lost position. And what is even perhaps more important is that the knights after e5 are really lacking good squares to go to, and you will see in the remainder of the game how white is struggling to find good places, good squares for the knights. So this transformation, I think it really shows some very nice understanding by me at the age of 14. But it's also, this is a moment to speak objectively about the position, and the reason I said that this is losing is that here in fact white had a really strong forcing continuation, which would have refuted black's beautiful strategical idea, and that starts with the move queen h6. It's a piece sacrifice, but again I would say it's not an obvious one, and it's well, the refutation is far from easy to see or calculate. So e takes d4, rook knight f4 now, threatening knight d5, but also knight h5. Okay, bishop b7, controlling the d5 square, and also attacking the e4 pawn. Rook h3, threatening mate. Rook g7, all forced by now, and now knight h5, going after the rook, but also perhaps after the pawn. So rook a g8, and it appears that black is kind of almost there, defending. But now white has the only move that not only wins, but also avoids losing, because everything else loses for white. For example, taking on g7 is bad, because after rook g7, g5, queen d8, black successfully defends the f6 pawn and actually has a material advantage to bishops for a rook. But by inverting the move order and playing g5 first, white actually manages to win. And after f takes g5, for example, knight takes g7, rook takes g7, f6, and white wins. So this complicated variation would have been the refutation of my positional understanding, yeah? But as you see, it's not an easy one, and well, can't blame myself for missing it. So white played knight f3, natural move, and now I continue in prophylactic mode by playing b4, stopping knight c3, knight d5 by controlling the c3 square. In fact, it was better to do so by developing bishop b7 and the controlling d5, and the justification for this is that knight c3 is not very good, because after b4, knight d5, the land knight's on d5, but after bishop takes d5, rook d5, there is queen e3 check, and black wins a pawn. King b1, queen e4. So this would have been another way to prevent the knight transfer to d5. I must have missed it, and I went for the more direct one, just controlling the c3 square. Knight d2 now by white, perhaps going knight c3, knight c4, knight e3, and then knight d5. Now bishop b7 developing and targeting the e4 pawn, and queen f3. So white is reinforcing the defense of the e4 pawn and still intends to reroute this knight from d2 either via c4 to e3 or via f1 to e3 and finally land to d5. So the battle is strategic one. It's all about who gets to control and dominate the d5 square. For the time being, it is black controlling it with the bishop and white not being able to land a piece on that square. And as the game shows, it actually black is successful in this fight, and thanks to this success of being able to control the d5 square, turns the game in his favor. So now rook a c8 developing, but also controlling the c4 square and avoiding knight c4. King b1 getting the king out of the c file, and now simply a5. The point is that black simply wants to get the pawn all the way to a3 and weaken white's king's position. So from this moment onwards, black is already taking over the initiative, and white is struggling with his pieces what to do. Knight g3, the knight was really badly placed on e2, and all thanks to this pawn on e5, which was taking away the d4 and f4 squares from that knight. From g3, the knight reinforces the e4 pawn, and also maybe can be rerouted via f1 and e3. So a4, I continue with my plan. Knight d f1, bishop a6, attacking the rook, rook d2, and a3. So black is just in time to weaken the white's king. The point being that white can't keep the queen side closed with b3 because the rook c3 just comes in right in time. And there is no knight e3 because the e3 square is controlled. So white insists on getting the knight to d5, knight e3, but a b2, knight d5, and queen a5 is the tactical justification that I saw. The point being that the piece sacrificed knight e7 fails to bishop c4, and white is actually mated. So in a way, white managed to finally land the knight on d5, but in the process of doing so allowed such a big weakening of the king his king that the weakening of the king is the decisive factor in the position. So the knight on d5 actually is useless. So it's an interesting strategical battle in this game where I happen to be have the better understanding. They managed to outplay my opponent. So since the pawn on b2 is quite a nuisance for white, white took it, king takes b2, and now bishop c4, attacking a2, but also targeting that knight on d5. If necessary, it can be taken. Another pretty straightforward win was rook c3, because the knight cannot really be taken, as then the rook cannot be taken because, let's say, rook c3, knight c3, bc3 check, queen c3, and let's say something like rook b8 wins the queen. So that was another winning move, but bishop c4 also suffices. Rook a1, and now simply bishop d8. And I like it how let's say the long-term advantages in black's position, which is the much safer king and the bad king white has, are the defining and decisive factors, and black has the time to simply improve its worst piece, the dark squared bishop. Getting to b6 and d4 would be decisive, and this would, once the bishop lands on b6, it will force white to exchange this beautiful knight that it took so long to get to d5. So h3, white must have been frustrated for not being able to move the queen from f3 because all the time the pawn on g4 was hanging. So in this moment he wastes a move to defend that pawn on g4, but when the house is burning, obviously there's no time for this, but even objectively speaking, white was already lost here. So bishop b6, continuing the plan. The plan is obviously to the bishop from e7 to be transferred to the dominating d4 square. White cannot allow that. The bishop must be taken, queen b6, and now white doesn't even have a pretty knight for the suffering. Knight f1, rushing to replace the knight, but it's just there is no time for that. Now another fine prophylactic move, queen a6, stopping knight e3, because the queen no longer controls the third rank, because there is queen a3 coming. And then the knight is pinned, cannot even go to d5 because the queen is hanging. So knight g3 instead, but obviously this is just a waste of time, and I think, and by here we were in time trouble. So and mind you, this was played on analog clocks. Forget about increments or anything, and in fact the games were adjourned after move 60, so there was the first time control at move 40. This is move 33, mutual time trouble, so obviously the quality of the moves couldn't be that high, but I actually managed to keep the quality of my moves pretty high, even in time trouble, even though the position is not that difficult anymore. So bishop b5, another nice move, allowing for rook c3. And now everything falls apart. White went king c1, but this just drops a piece. Rook c3, attacking the queen, but also the knight, as you will see, queen f2 and queen a3 check, and also winning the knight. So the rest was just time trouble. So king d1, rook g3, rook d6, rook f3, attacking the queen and threatening rook f1, queen c5, rook f1, king d2. And now the final curious moment in this game. Of course, I could have just taken the rook, but at that time I was influenced by Capablanca's and Fischer's ways of converting an advantage. When they would have an advantage, they would just always seek simplifications and go in for an endgame. And especially in time trouble, I saw here that I can actually exchange queens with tempo and win the rook afterwards. So I played queen c3, and after queen c3, bc3, my opponent resigned, because after rook a1 next, I will be a rook and a piece up. So that's a bit too much. So a very nice game, I would say, in spite of the some mistakes which were inevitable, obviously. I'm quite happy how I played this game, being a Najdorf, and showing this understanding of exchanging the strong knight for the bad bishop on d3 and following up with d5, the fight for the d5 square, so typical for the Najdorf, and how I managed to show better understanding of the position, and also to manage to transfer that understanding to good moves, and those good moves being enough to outplay my opponent and win a pretty decent game, I would say. So I would conclude this video on this note. You can read a bit more about that period of mine in the Substack newsletter that I just sent out today, and yeah, about my some troubles and some career path along the way, that, well, some of the adventures I had. So I'll thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, subscribe to my weekly Substack, support me in any way you can, follow me on Twitter, comment, well, just stay in touch as usual. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you pretty soon again. Take care.